Okay, so we just developed this quantity theory of money, which, let's kind of remind you, says that the inflation rate should be equal to the growth rate of the money supply minus the growth rate of real GDP. And so I've plotted here with data exactly that. So on the horizontal axis, we have growth rate of the money supply minus growth rate of real GDP. And on the vertical axis, we have the inflation rate. And so what I've plotted here is the 45-degree line where the quantity theory holds exactly at all points on this line. So let's take Argentina, whose money supply grew at minus the growth rate of real GDP was 80%. So let's say the growth rate of the money supply was 82%, the growth rate of real GDP was 2%, the difference gives me 80%. So the money supply was growing very quickly. If the quantity theory holds, with an 80% difference there, I should get an 80% inflation rate, which is exactly what I get. So as long as the data for countries lines up on the 45-degree line, our quantity theory of money is holding true in reality. And what we see here with all these different points is that, yes, that is true, right? By and large, the quantity theory of money seems to hold. I mean, there's some small differences, but they're fairly small. So the faster my money supply grows, the faster my inflation rate is going to be. And so you notice some of these countries here have experienced pretty high inflation rates, well, Argentina included, right? So we're in excess here of inflation above 20%, meaning the price of goods and services, the cost of living, is increasing by 20% or more per year, up to as high as 80% in Argentina. And so that's interesting, and you might wonder, well, why would a country increase the growth rate of the money supply that quickly? So why was Argentina increasing the money supply by 80%, 82%, as opposed to real GDP growing by 2%, giving them 80% inflation? What in the world would cause a country to do that? Well, that's a good question. So one thing we can look at is hyperinflation. And a lot of different ways you could think about hyperinflation. It's really just what it sounds like, very fast inflation. And so you could think of this as the amount of time it takes for the price level to double, or another way is to think of the price level doubles in 3 years, something along those lines. So price level doubles in 3 years or less. Right, so you have to have a very high rate of inflation. So hyperinflation is just very high inflation. And there's been lots of episodes of hyperinflation over time. And I have you go through a few of them on one of the exercises. So in Zimbabwe, for example, inflation rate was like 200 million%. Which is pretty crazy. More recently, you have Venezuela. And they had inflation rates of about 1,600% in 2018. So just to get a sense of how much that is going to be. So I've written down some numbers here. That tends to be, so if you took $20 for a night out, in 1 year at that inflation rate, that night out would cost you $352. So just think about that. You start the year in January, you go out with your friends, you take $20 out, and you have a good time. Next January, you want to go out with your friends, you need to carry $350 in your wallet. 1 more year at that inflation rate, you're looking at about $6,000 at that inflation rate to make the night out, and it increases from there, right? So when the inflation rate is growing very quickly, the cost of goods and services is going up just as quickly. So what in the world causes these hyperinflations? Well, that'll be the next thing that we try to figure out here. It has to do with actions from the government with deficits and borrowing money to finance those deficits.